Hello and welcome. This is Victor Magariño, and today I have a guest who is a subscriber that decided to get in contact with me to speak about criticism, some of the criticisms posed to Marxist economic theory and the potential solutions that we might find to them. So, Lupe Arismendez, please introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Lupe, and I've been a Marxist for most of my life, and I, pre- I feel like I'm pretty familiar with all of the subjects, as well as some general philosophy questions.
Mhm. Well, we didn't really have too much of a plan regarding which specific criticisms we were gonna address, but I certainly have heard so many that we can just pull some out of the blue without any problems. And the first one I wanted to comment on was this was some criticisms to the labor theory of values, since the labor theory of values essentially the basis of the entire criticism to capitalism that Marx made. I mean, it's the first thing that he talks about when he starts Das Kapital, and it's thus the main thing that the critics of Marx have focused on. So what is your opinion, to begin with, Guadalupe, on the criticisms you have heard so far of the labor theory of value?
My opinion is that most of the arguments come from a lack of understanding of Marxism. Most of the comments that I've heard are all very superficial. They don't get past the first volume, or particularly even the first a few chapters of Capital, and they don't really understand any of the positions that Marx has. Um, I guess one of the easiest examples is supply and demand, which most people think are common sense, and rightfully so because it's in within the first few chapters of Capital. And the fact that they say that Marx's theory it doesn't make sense because it doesn't have supply and demand is a testament to the fact that they haven't read the first few pages.
Absolutely. I mean, this is Marx was so clear about this. One of his one of his first sentences when he's speaking about the value of commodities is that commodities, before they have any exchange value, before they have any price, they must be useful. And some people even take this as a contradiction in Marx, because he begins by saying commodities must be useful in order to be commodities, and then he says, but the source of value is labor, not usefulness. And then they say, well, this is a contradiction in Marx, and we should just read the first pages of Das Kapital, and then the rest where he just talks about value, about labor being the source of value, ignore them. And this is, I mean, this is completely wrong. I mean, beginning by saying that something is a prerequisite for value doesn't mean that it's the source of value itself. This is as clear as this is logic 101. I mean, when you say, look, commodities must be useful, some people must find things useful before these things becoming to commodities. But the source of value itself is labor. It's not the usefulness that the commodity brings, because there's two main points that he makes. One, because usefulness is not quantifiable, and commodities don't tend to any mean of usefulness, because there's no way of quantifying usefulness, because the usefulness that a commodity has for someone else might be completely different to mine. Where's your take on that?
I would, I think I'd say that one that a use value being quantifiable doesn't really affect too much the theory. Um, it has how should I put it? It is the dialectic. It is a slight of a contradiction, but that doesn't mean that it isn't resolved. You can have both. You have to have where the commodity's value is determined by multiple things, and that if if something has more labor, it doesn't necessarily mean more value, and if it has more value, that doesn't mean it has more labor. So it has to
Yeah,
be a bit
absolutely.
of both, and they work together to make the value of the commodity.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think this is exactly what Marx was trying to convey there. Was he was saying, look,
Right.
usefulness is a necessity, but it is not the sole determinant of value itself. There's some other components to the value of commodities that we should look at, and exchange value itself. Um, and the way he describes it is, when we go to the market and we see all sorts of exchange values being exchanged in different proportions, what we see is a certain a property of commensurability, right? We see that some commodity on some quantum of that commodity can be exchanged by all other commodities in principle on some quantum of any of those commodities. And the fact that they do this means that they converge to a social mean. And since there's no social mean of usefulness, there needs to be something else, and that is labor. Because labor is the only thing that all commodities have in common, being the product of labor.
Right, and I do like
And
the argument that he gives for abstracting away all of the material elements of the commodity, because if you go off of any particular form of measurement, for instance, weight or uh, or size, or any particular measurement that you have for a commodity, one commodity could be the same but still be valued differently, and it has to come back to something that is consistent within all of the commodities, which is the fact that they're created by people.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, um, there are some people that make this criticism that Marx actually did include in his chapter. Well, then natural resources, for example, natural resources have value, and they don't come about by means of labor. They are just there. What is your explanation for this, they ask. And Marx already commented on this. I mean, natural resources have value regardless of whether they are produced by human beings, but the sole act of utilizing those natural resources implies labor. I mean, for example, a water bottle. So water itself is a natural resource that we find on rivers, on the sea, wherever, and that we can drink without having to pay someone for it. I mean, unless it's owned by a private entity. But the fact that someone had to extract that water from the river, for example, put it into a bottle, and then sell it to you implies labor. And even
Right.
though water is a natural resource, there's labor put into that water bottle being in your desk. And thus there's value created there.
Yes, that's a very good point. You did bring up. I mean, I did see something that I wanted to address right now, and that's when Marx says that value cannot be created in exchange. It's a pretty held belief, pretty widely held belief between most Marxists, but I do disagree with this a little bit, and I don't think that the theory is unsound if you exclude it, but I do think it is important for it to discuss. So Marx believed that it's only labor that creates value and not exchange. For instance, if I trade you something that's undervalued, you would be losing value as I'll be getting more value in exchange because I traded something that wasn't worth the same. However, the total amount of value that we have collectively is the same.
Mhm.
I do disagree with that, and the main reason why I do is because of something that's also in Marx, where he talks about how means of uh, means of transportation, communication themselves have value. So, for instance, building railways is a source of value, and this is something that he says uh, separate from the actual labor as transportation and communications itself. And the reason why I think he said this was because if you improve these two aspects, then that means you're able to uh, spread labor throughout the region a lot more efficiently. And spreading the labor is a means of value. So that in the same way that people, well, let's get through that point first. Um, he believed that any money that's labor that's spent towards transportation and communication will be a means of value itself. Um, do you have any? Are you
Yes, I
following me
mean,
now?
yeah, any labor that is inputted on the means of transportation of communication will be added to the commodity as well. I mean, it's productive value. I mean, it's not productive value per se because you're not producing the commodity itself, but you're producing the act of the commodity being at the disposal of the at display for the consumer, and that itself is also creating value.
Right.
You
And
see what I mean?
yes, to me, it seems like what he's saying is that a commodity has value if the labor that went into it I mean, if the commodity has a use,
Mm-hmm.
and any labor that's used for transportation and communication, almost by definition, has a use, which is to extend the market. And the market itself is useful in that it balances out the labor. I mean, the relative labor and relative value of the commodities. So, for instance, if there's it's easier to have a monopoly if there's a smaller marketplace where it's easier to take over. And expanding the market, expanding transportation for labor markets and communication for commodities actually makes is overall a good because it's expanding what what the market allows.
Yeah.
It's basically to say that that is by definition a use value in Marx, and and the problem that I have is that he generally takes the use value as not making too much of a difference, and in this particular instance, he says that it's almost by definition a good use. I don't know if you see any contradictions within Marx that particular argument.
No, in that particular thing, I don't really see any contradictions because um, for Marx, use value is not is not something that you just set aside and you don't regard in any scenario. It's just something that for the I mean for the development of the theory has to be temporarily be set aside but kept in the image so that people understand the other aspects of value. And I mean, and use value is one thing, exchange value is another thing, value is a different thing, and price is essentially, well, it's pretty much exchange value. But what we cannot what we cannot be doing here is conflating the different levels of value that he projects into the commodity, or that he describes in commodities, since this is one of the main sources of the criticisms to Marx, that they don't understand. And actually, this is one of the things that I've heard a lot, people saying, well, Marx just jumps around from use value to exchange value to value without really making any connection from anyone. But in reality, the ones that are doing that are the critics themselves, because they, I mean, it's no news that critics of Marx don't understand the differences between these different values.
Right, and he does a very good job of being straightforward with his representation. He takes it one step at a time and starts from the same starting point as other economists at the time, as starting with the commodity. So I mean, it's hard. It's easier for me to believe that people don't know what they're talking about than it is that they went through the work and actually just couldn't uh, and came up to the conclusion that he doesn't know what he's talking about. Um,
Yeah.
I'm trying to think, but I mean, for me though, to hear something like that about the usefulness of transportation and communication, it seems to me that it's either a bias or that it's actually the influences of the market being the usefulness. And Marx uses the market, especially when it comes to socially necessary labor time. He Most people say that it becomes the difference in a person's wage is what he negotiates with the employer. However, the definition that Marx used is what the what the employer would get and what the employee would get in the market. He judges it off of the entire collection of employers and vice versa. Same for the commodities. If you're going to the market to get a commodity, it's not what you would pay for it. It's what you would pay in addition to everybody else when they go to the market.
Yeah, exactly. It's a social mean. It's and this is one of the things that I wanted to introduce now when discussing the one of the main criticisms that we hear a lot, and this is the essentially the mud pie argument, right? The argument that something that has no use value whatsoever, if you input a lot of labor into it, it's not gonna make that thing, whatever it is, a mud pie, for example, more valuable, since people are still not gonna want to buy it. And the reason for this is essentially described by Marx: is things need commodities require usefulness to be commodities. And once we've determined that something is socially acceptable, that something um, has use value, not for one person alone, but for an entire society, that is something that people demand in general in that society, then other forces get into the picture. And this is where labor comes into the picture. And labor is not equal to value in the sense that regardless of how much labor you input into a commodity, that commodity will have as much value as you input in there. There is a social mean that commodities converge to, and those commodities that are that can be produced in less time will be cheaper in the market because there's less value in less labor input into them, and thus those commodities will tend to prevail in the market since people will prefer those over commodities with a higher uh, market price. And thus this is objective. This is as objective as it gets. This is why people try to put the mud pie argument as a reason for why labor is subjective, but in reality this is as objective as it is. You don't go to a market, you take an apple and you say, well, you know what, I value this apple as 20 cents. You're selling it for $1, imagine. Well, no, my personal the personal thing that I would do here is I would just pay for 20 cents, give it for 20 cents. This is not how it works. You go into a store, you see the market price, and you buy it at that price. And the market price fluctuates depending on the conditions of the market, depending on the cost of inputs, etc. But this is not subjective at all. This is as objective as it gets. And if you're a producer and you want to sell at a price higher than the social mean, you will go out of business, objectively out of business,
Right, and I
unless
do want to
yeah, continue.
address. I do want to address that there is a difference between the audience that may be listening. There are some who are very very well educated in economics, and there's some that are only listening for their bias against Marx. And when you're making that point, a lot of people would say that the the liberal economics uh, works the same way that you're describing it. When you go into the market, they don't send it at that. They make a price determination on how much they think it's worth, and then depending on how many people buy it, they'll raise or lower the price to fit supply and demand, and it functions kind of reactively. However, the point I just wanted to make was that everything that they accept in that same definition is there present in Marx, which most people reject, and that if somebody comes and says that, oh, well, it's not using the subjective value, it's not using, it still functions in the exact same way. And that's one of the more important parts, is that people leave him in the back just because his value theory functions slightly differently, even if the result is the same, and that it's objective on. Because to me, when I just want to go on a small tangent,
Yeah.
to me, I think if you have a theory of value and it's consistent, you should be able to reach the same point coming from different directions. He started with the commodity. However, I believe that you could start with something much more like use value, which is, albeit a little bit more difficult. If you have a commodity such as an apple,
Hmm.
it's going to have a certain usefulness in relationship to others. And this is where people talk about subjective value. It's not entirely subjective, because you're going to know what people do want more and what people do want less. Just as a general survey, people, as a definition, are going to need water and food, and those you can already put as having higher usefulness than other commodities which are superfluous. And you can work through what commodities you do have to come up with that definition, because it is set by the market. And if you have collectively people who want an apple a certain amount as compared to other fruits and vegetables, then it is going to be worth that much in relationship to the others.
Yeah, absolutely. And furthermore, this is not that we haven't measured this. There's empirical studies analyzing input output data on multiple countries such as Great Britain, France, and Germany, and all those studies point to the conclusion that the labor theory of value, which essentially says that the market price of commodities is directly proportional to the labor inputted into them, is essentially proven in this. This theory is essentially proven in these articles. I mean, using input output data, we see a clear correlation, direct correlation between these two things. And furthermore, the only outliers in the data tend to be oil prices, for example, that Marx already described as problematic, since they fluctuate, they vary depending on other forces. And um, and, uh, and this is no new thing. I mean, it's not like we haven't already tested this, because some people just claim, oh, there's no empirical data for this. Yes, there is. It's just that you haven't taken the time to look at it. Maybe you don't care. I don't know, but there is these studies. Go
And
criticize those studies and then come back and say, well, you know what, this is not true, or maybe you change your mind, but this has been
well,
tested.
I'm a little bit less, or much less empirical than Marx was. Marx did use research that was available at the time. He did
Correct.
his own studies. Like, he was very empirical with his observations, and I personally am a little bit less, only because I don't trust the research of others. It's very easy to see many examples of how people can come up with wrong conclusions of very simple subjects. Just GDP would be an easy one, as well as even Bernie Sanders. Was it the Medicare for all? It's
Mhm.
very easy to come up with different numbers when you come up with different starting positions.
Yeah, but
And
when
that
you're running linear regression, when you're running a certain experiment, I mean, there is no way of faking. I mean, there is ways of faking this, but the data there is pretty clear. I mean, they take the data from the official sources, they put it in well, they make a statistics analysis on them, and then they see how they're directly correlated. There's no I mean, and if there is, I haven't seen any, but if there is, then I would like people to point out exactly where the problems, maybe with the sources of data, maybe with the processing of the data, maybe with ad hoc explanations. I don't know, but so far I haven't seen any problems with that, and the studies are very clear about this.
And they could be 100% correct. It's just a preference for me, uh, that I don't prefer those empirical arguments. I also don't prefer arguments by morality. I prefer consistency of the system. If it makes sense and if everything is coherent, then it's right by my eyes. And
Yeah,
when he explains the contradictions within capitalism, to me, it doesn't it doesn't uh, it doesn't follow that capitalism can work in the future and continue for forever, like they describe it. And I'm not talking about capitalism ending within 100 years, 200 years. I'm talking about uh, if everything left uh, from its conception was followed through perfectly, that it will eventually collapse.
yeah,
So that's more what I'm talking about. So I personally take the more logical approach. Now, I think Marx's system is much more logically sound, and if it is, and if everything makes sense, then it would follow that the system would work, or that there would be some problem within society that's preventing it. For instance, you can point to a lot of countries that attempted to become communist, but before that was even an option, it was removed by larger imperialist forces. Um, Examples in Southeast Asia, in Central and South America,
Yeah.
where countries wanted to become communist, but it wasn't even an option allowed to them.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely, and that is a very important topic that we can get to. But I just want to clear up and to finish this point on the labor theory of value, and then we get to the next point. Okay,
Okay.
so just to conclude on this is there are studies that prove the labor theory of value, which is the theory that essentially very in a very summarized manner uh, says that there's a direct correlation between the labor input of commodities and their value in the market, and their studies are there, are public, you can see it yourself, and this is not even something so complicated to grasp. This is something that should be a lot more intuitive. I mean, by definition, when things are more costly, when things cost more to produce, they cost more in the market. This is intuition 101. And the fact that some people want to renounce this intuition for ideological purposes uh, tells us a lot about the state of ideology in our society nowadays.
Right. I will also mention that there are a lot more developments in terms of the consistency of Marxist doctrine that have been made within the last few decades. For instance, you had mentioned before the transformation problem. Well, that, along with other aspects of the labor theory of value, have actually been discovered to be true, and I've seen by multiple sources that it's different advances in mathematics that have
Yeah.
all gone along with being able to prove mathematically and empirically that Marxism is correct. It's really a lack of education and uh, basically familiarization with the subject that causes people to be so opposed to it. Most of the time, people don't know what it means when I say that I'm a Marxist. They really have never been confronted with that question before.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think this is one of the reasons why I wanted to start doing these videos and going to Adam Frenet's channel and to Alan Rush's channel, because we need to let people know what our position really is. We need to let people know that we're not just murderous people that want to destroy Western civilization, you know. We need to
Right.
show that there is consistency in our beliefs, that we are willing to open up discussion about topics, that we're willing to change our minds. And if you have good reasons to change our minds, I mean, at least I am open to changing my mind on anything. In fact, I wasn't a Marxist for most of my life. I was raised essentially as a centrist, right wing centrist, and that is what I was until I started looking deeply into into the arguments, etc. And I realized, you know what, this sounds a lot more convincing than what I thought at the beginning.
Um, I generally take the as a rule of thumb that if it sounds wrong, then a little bit of investigation will usually prove that it's wrong.
Yeah,
And when I'm going through and looking at certain aspects of the society, you'll see that if somebody's paid in fair wage, just if it feels like they're getting cheated and they're getting cut short, then it generally is after like some investigation when you find out how the money is being distributed and what are the profits, what are all the informations that it's not to me the fact that somebody is being exploited. To me, it's the fact that they're working for a wage which is separate from what the market value is. A lot of times employers within their own company don't allow employees to share how much wage they're making, which is the exact same as being able to see your wages among your peers? And how do you
Yeah,
set your wage when you don't know what anybody else makes?
yeah, no,
And so kinds
absolutely.
of it's those kinds of little things that cause someone to get paid slightly less or slightly more than what they actually deserve. It's generally slightly less. And those little differences are what I'm talking about when I say that somebody is being underpaid. It's not so much that somebody benefits off of them, because uh, to a certain respect, some money has to be set aside in the same way that we have a government set aside money. And the fact that it is done almost like a, a monarch, that it's done like an oligarchy, that very few people make the decision, that part is also contestable. However, in the same way that the government functions, where money has to be set aside, I do think that it's right for there to be exploitation to a certain degree. However, it's whenever it's beyond what's necessary, and it's when it's your peers that are all doing the same work as you make more than you kind of questions.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And you know what? This is what I wanted to get next because you know that the following step that Marx takes in Das Kapital after talking about the labor theory of value is essentially the theory of exploitation, which he presents essentially right after. And this is one of the criticisms that I've heard a lot, which you just touched on a little bit, which is people think that for Marx, that Marx is trying to make the argument. First of all, people think that Marx is making the moral argument that people just deserve this value, that there is somewhat that there is an injustice there. And what Marx is proving, he's proving two things. But the first thing that he's proving is first that capitalism is inconsistent with its own ideology because the ideology of capitalism is the values of the French revolutions, right? Égalité, fraternité, liberté. And what he's saying is essentially, look, according to these own principles that we used to justify capitalism to begin with, there is no equality, there is no justice, there is no fraternity in the production process in capitalism because we are taking the value that some people produced and giving it immediately to other people, and these people own the value of the workers even before the workers produce it themselves because they already own the means of production. And this is essentially what he's trying to say. There's no really any moral argument per se. He's just pointing out an inconsistency in the ideology that prevails in capitalist societies, especially in the epoch that he lived in, which is the 19th century. And then what he's saying is, look, I'm proving to you that workers are not getting the equal amount. I mean, that the wage they receive is not equal to the amount of labor that they produce, the amount of value that they produce, sorry. And and then the implication is, well, is it then the implication that workers should receive the full amount of what they produce? And Marx was not making that argument. Marx was saying, look, workers under capitalism certainly are not, which is what people were trying to say they were. They were getting this full amount. And Marx pointed out that they don't. And second, he said the fact that they don't means that some people are going to get richer and richer over time, and some other people are not going to improve. They're not going to see this improvement, and thus they're going to rebel, and thus there's going to be these preponderant inequalities, and thus these contradictions are going to translate into um, class warfare that is going to end capitalism at some point.
Right. He makes the two general arguments that if left to its own devices, there will be large monopolies. There will be a concentration and centralization of capital. And then in the second argument, that if if it's mediated through the market, then there will be influctual. I'm sorry. If it's mediated through the market, and people are paid their fair wages, then the money is not going to be able to be properly distributed, assuming that all of the basic capitalist starting points are true. So those two conflicts have been proven to be right. There is large scale inequality, and centralization of capital. And there is also the instability that leads to market crashes, which at the time that he was writing, people thought it was impossible to have a generalized crash of the market.
Yeah, yeah, and this is essentially. I don't know if you watched the video that I posted yesterday on inequality, where I essentially talk about this specific point, which is the source of the tremendous disparities we see today in wealth and in income is essentially exploitation. It cannot be anything else, and the relationship between exploitation and wealth and the wealth of the capitalist class is there's a clear direct relationship here, not only between nations but even within a nation in different periods of its history. What I proved is essentially that in those periods of history where workers have more power, more bargaining power, the capitalist cannot extract as much surplus value as it can under other circumstances that benefit him more, and thus those instances in history are going to be the ones where the top 1%, the top 0.01%, the capitalist class essentially, is going to be richer. And the data shows this clearly well, not only amongst nations, where we see that European nations, where there's more collective bargaining power for workers, where there's more trade union density, where um, there are more socialist parties that defend workers' rights, etc. Europe scores better than any other nation, than any other continent in terms of equality. And for example, the US having a significantly less representation of workers on parliament, or for example, in terms of trade union density and collective bargaining power, has immense levels of inequality. And even if the data, and I've heard some people trying to criticize this position by saying, well, the data is not reliable, um, because the top 1% don't own that much wealth. Well, imagine that it's not 41%, the 41% of the total wealth that's owned by the 1%. Imagine it's not 41. Imagine it's 30%. We're gonna be very um, we're gonna give them. Imagine we give them that. Even though they don't show exactly how this data is inconsistent, but imagine we give them that. It's still a lot, and it still becomes higher when workers have less power. Thus, the only source of this wealth can be there's nothing else, only exploitation.
Right. Um, I think it is a lot of different points that we'd have to move through. So I'm just going to focus on one in particular. When people talk about the value of labor and the value within the society, uh, it, I just want to make this a clear point, just because it is something that most people don't understand when they're coming into the field, and it's a gateway into Marxism. The value of the labor is dependent on the socially necessary labor time. That means that within your society, it's going off of what is necessary. And if you have certain conditions that cause it to be a certain value, then that is what the value will be, almost definitionally. Now, when we went through in the United States different social changes, for instance, women coming into the workforce, what that does is that cheapens the amount of labor that's necessary to reproduce not the individual but the household. So, as a household, you're able to make less money to outcompete those who only have single workers in the family. And what that causes is the value of labor to drop as a whole. The invention of the computer and exporting jobs are all examples of that. So as the what is it, the supply of labor increases, then that means the value of labor is actually going to decrease. And it's not so much the fact that it's one particular country. So, for instance, I do want to make this distinction, because when we have large supermarkets enter small neighborhoods, they usually describe it as being something bad because it pushes out all of the businesses within the community. Uh, there's certain small businesses that just can't compete. However, what's happening is that the jobs are being lost, but it's very possible that the jobs are being lost at a greater rate than the sorry, if the jobs being lost are at a smaller rate than the value saved by paying cheaper wages to offshore the business. So we get a lot of cheap goods from China, and we at our loss of jobs because of it. There's very little work. However, it's very easy to prove that we actually benefit from exploiting the fact that we get cheap commodities from over there. We get cheap materials, and uh, basically, my point is that our value, the way that we determine our wages, isn't tied to just our society. It's also connected to the wages that are paid in China for the goods that we purchase here, and if the jobs are offshored, say to automobile industries and now in Mexico, we purchase those commodities still, and all of the labor that goes into it is all tied to that product or the commodity. So we still may be benefiting, even if we have even less and less jobs, by the fact that they get paid so little in other countries. So it is a question of income inequality, even if it's not within our own country. And uh, one of the main arguments is that in first world countries, capitalism works. However, it's not so much because the businesses travel from country to country. They're not really located in one particular country. And if they sell commodities at a cheaper rate, but are exploiting people in third world countries, then it's not quite one country over another country. It's one system where the proletariat is actually not located in that same country.
Yes, I see the point there, and I think you touched at the beginning of this last exposition. I think you touched on a very important thing, which is the labor that labor power is a commodity itself under capitalism, and thus its value is also going to be determined by the socially necessary amount of labor time required to produce and reproduce that particular form of that particular labor power that you're looking at. And this is why, for example, workers in China, maybe not so much now, but at least, I mean, depending on where you go, but this is, for example, why workers in China have are paid less because the socially necessary amount of labor time to reproduce a Chinese worker, the labor power of a Chinese worker, is less than the necessary labor time required, for example, in the United States because for multiple reasons. First of all, because they are less educated, depending again on where you go. But here we're looking at industrial workers, construction workers. They are less educated. They living standards, depending on where you go as well, but living standards tend to be lower. Prices tend to be lower. So, for example, in terms of food, you're going to have to pay less for food. You're going to have to pay less for shelter, and they, for example, they can only have one kid in case they have not now, but in the time they only have one kid, and thus the amount of labor time necessary to reproduce the labor power of a Chinese worker is a lot less. Thus, it is obvious that labor is going to be cheaper there. And for a
Well,
capitalist that is
people,
trying to maximize profit, the cost of inputs, including labor, is what's going to drive how much profit you can get in the market. And thus, minimizing costs is the best strategy to maximizing profit.
right.
And that is why they move their production and they essentially move the proletariat from one part of the world to another, which is what you were trying to make here. But it doesn't even mean that there is no proletariat in the United States or in Europe. There is proletariat in the United States and Europe. Only that the proletariat has now adopted, instead of being an industrial proletariat, they're still industrial proletariat, but even though it's not mainly composed by industrial workers, it is, for example, in Spain, we have this thing where the proletariat is mainly composed by workers in the service sector, in the sector of hotels, of restaurants, of um vacation resorts, etc. It's
And that is the
produced
same the way that it is in the United States. It's mostly in service sections as well.
exactly, and that is still a proletariat. It's not an industrial proletariat, but these are still workers that produce value and that are exploited essentially by companies that profit immensely from that. And this is one of the problems we have clearly in Spain is not only underemployment but especially poor employment, because the employment that we do have is characterized by low wages, by very by a lot of temporality, meaning that it's only, for example, reduced, your contract is only reduced to the time where there's more tourists, for example, in summer or in some points of spring and winter. And thus, these people are exploited as well. It's not that you have to be working in a factory to be a proletariat, to be part of the proletariat. It doesn't mean that. Marx was not obviously so simplistic, but at his time, it was a lot more obvious that the proletariat was an industrial one, and thus the way he described it was essentially like that. But nowadays, we need obviously to look at things from the modern perspective, but the theory itself still fits our modern world, and this is the important thing. We still see a proletariat in Western capitalist societies. It's not like it doesn't exist. It's not like, oh, the middle class. Well, the middle class is essentially a fable nowadays, especially after the last crisis. The middle class has suffered great losses, and the middle class, some people present it as the proof that the dichotomy between the proletariat and the capitalist class is a false dichotomy. And and for me, this doesn't really hold, because um, first of all, for Marx, class was not determined by how much money you have, but by how much economic power you have, determined by the ownership of the means of production. That is class distinction there. And some people in the middle class are bourgeois in the sense that they own small businesses, and some people in the middle class are still proletariats, still work in certain companies and still produce some value, and but they don't own themselves the company. It's not like the middle class is one whole group, homogeneous group that doesn't fit any category. It can fit any of the categories.
Yeah, there was a there's something I need to mention first. I am not going to remember the economist's name, and I don't think that he was that important. I think that those who those who know of him, because he's a libertarian economist, those who know of him will know of what I'm referring to. There's someone who, in front of his class, he took out an iPhone. He raised it up in the air and said that this is something that everybody has. Even it doesn't matter how poor you are, because that they live in a capitalist country. But that's the those are the instances when it's important to make that distinction. I think he was 100% wrong because even the poorest of poor don't have close to an iPhone. Like I've seen the poorest. I mean, the poorest of just my hometown, and they're much worse than that. So the fact that he thinks that everybody, regardless of how much money they make, still or don't make, still have an iPhone, still have property to call their own. There's people who don't have anything, and are completely alienated from the workforce. And there's people who, even working, still can't afford anything uh, as an iPhone. I mean, a lot of people have it because it's become so cheap, but they make that distinction and still ignore the fact that the proletariat in the United States, in particular, does struggle an awful lot.
Yeah.
The people who have very little struggle from day to day at a great deal, but it also extends in the instances where he talks about where of the luxuries that we have uh, to the countries that supply those luxuries. For instance, almost everybody has microwaves, fridges. They have welfare to benefit from, and there's so many resources out there where it's actually not simply uh, a matter of how much you have. People still struggle despite of it, and that's where it pushes what's socially necessary. To socially necessary reproduce the labor, uh, it it's very much pushing on what the limits of the laborer can take. And in the United States, it is going to be using some form of technology as necessary in order to reproduce it. It is going to be using, you know, schooling and different modes that don't necessarily exist in poorer countries, but that doesn't mean that they are free from being from the working class, and they themselves feel that to be true. People who disagree only disagree because they think that people who are actually poor are better off than they actually are, but they know that it's not the case, and they see how difficult it is to live within this society. But in instances where someone talks about having an iPhone and being the difference between capitalism and socialism, the iPhone is not made by uh, fully capitalist countries. It's not made by the same workers that purchase them. And what ends up happening is that you're purchasing, just as I described, something cheaper and exploiting the proletariat in another country.
Yeah, and you know, and the point that you made, I think is very important because, you know, this line of argument for justifying capitalism with the iPhone was actually tried already in other previous societies, in feudal societies, for example, in European feudal societies. This argument was made, but instead of with an iPhone, with death. It was said, you know what? Because and economic historians now have proven this, that in feudal times and before the Industrial Revolution, people tended to die, regardless of their class, people tended to die in a similar fashion. People died normally at a certain age. It's not like today where rich people tend to live a lot more and so on. People tended to live the same age, and they tended to die in the same ways, of the same illnesses, etc. And the argument was made, look, people die regardless of whether they are of whether they are a monarch or not. So this means that death comes to everyone, right? And if death comes to everyone, there cannot be any inequalities in our society. Our society is perfectly justified. Everyone is going to die at some point. And this is the same point, but with the iPhone is, well, everyone has an iPhone today, right? Regardless of your class, you have an iPhone regardless. So look, our system gives the same things to everyone, but it's not the truth, because if we look at how people lived, even though people died in the same way, people lived in very different ways, and people lived under different conditions. And those that were in the classes that owned at the time land, that owned the military, that owned the political institutions, were the ones that lived a lot better, that had more power overall, and thus they could exploit other people. Now, the same goes for today. Even though people have certain things that are the same, they still live totally different. A proletariat, even a proletarian, even though he might have an iPhone, he lives completely different to a capitalist, completely different. And he has a completely different amount of power, and he has a completely different amount of opportunities. And this is what we're criticizing. We don't care about whether you have an iPhone or not. We care about whether you are free or not, about whether you are exploited or not.
Yeah, and I think this would be a good opportunity for us to move to the democracy aspect. People such as Richard Wolff talk about democratizing the enterprise. What do you feel on democracy within socialism?
This is a very good question, and the first thing that I want to comment is that, for me, essentially, socialism is taking democracy to the next step that capitalism hasn't achieved, which is democracy at the economic level, democracy at the level of the enterprise, at the level of the company, of the business. And for me, this is the final and the most important source of democracy that we need to reach, since from the economy emerge all the other aspects of a society. This is the materialistic aspect of Marx, right? Where he says there is two components to a society, two main components, which are the material basis and the ideological superstructure, and both are related to each other, and both sort of model each other, but the one where everything else comes from is essentially the material basis. And for me, reaching democracy at that level will yield better results in all other aspects, whether it might be morality, whether it might be political institutions. Because, for example, if you don't have um, if you don't have big capitalists that can buy politicians, our politicians are going to be less prone to corruption, and thus we're going to have a more equal system where there's these contradictions sort of disappear, right? And democracy at the enterprise level, for me, is essentially the first step that we need to take. I don't know what your take on this is, and I
I
think
do
it
believe
can be
it.
done. I think it can
Yeah,
be done.
I definitely agree. I think it can be done, and I don't believe that how should I put it? It is the first step. It's the first step to moving forward, but it's not the answer. I personally would like to see democracy in the workplace extended to not just the workplace decisions, but connected to the actual government democracy. Because me personally, I think that everyone uh, who works should be counted for a vote. I don't, to me, that's really what matters. And those who don't work, including capitalists who exploit their workers, shouldn't be allowed to vote. In the same way that if you don't work, then you shouldn't eat. In the same way, if you don't work, then it's hard for me to justify somebody still having a decision in where the money is allocated. That being said, I obviously think that if there shouldn't be unemployment because unemployment only refers to people who actually want to work, and there's value in work. The only problem is putting the work to use. There's so many people who would like to work and contribute to society. People with degrees, people who are very underpaid. However, they cannot actually do what they can contribute just because there isn't enough money to be made off of them.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, absolutely.
I'd extend the democratic aspect to connect to the government aspect. Me personally, I'd prefer to see the entire system function as if it were a direct democracy, where sorry, as if it were a republic, so that if you worked at a particular business, it would still function democratically within the business itself, but you'd also have it connected to the government where people would vote for representatives, not just in the workplace, but within the workplace, vote for representatives within communities and so on.
Yeah,
It's a personal belief. However, I think that moving towards democracy in the workplace is a good idea. My only contention with that is that it doesn't really move away from the marketplace, which still drives the cessionary labor time to decrease. It still pushes the workers in the same way, and it doesn't change any of the modes of production. To me, it functions in the same way that an economy would function when it's leaving feudalism, in that you're moving from having uh, a king to having a state with a president, uh, but the economics behind it are generally the same. Markets existed before there was capitalism, as did wage labor and so on. So all of these things still persisted. However, the way that the government function was actually different, and you would be adjusting the way that the business functions, but it doesn't change the economic system, in my opinion.
yeah, yeah. And to this, I tend to agree here with Slavoj Žižek somewhat on his idea that what we need today in today is not really this anarchist dream of small communes that decide everything and interact independently with each other, etc., which is so, which is actually what anyone that dreams would dream of, right? Of everyone having this direct control of his life. But for me today, this cannot be realized in the actual world. This is just an idealization of the perfect state of affairs. To me, today, especially in the global circumstances that we live in, where capitalism is not a local phenomenon but rather a global one, we need a strong state nation that can protect the rights of the workers from external and internal threats, but that it can, in a sense, it can have some international control as well, because this is one of the main issues that we've seen with the rise of socialism, in the and that you already pointed out before, is the fact that whenever there has been an attempt of empowering the workers, the capitalist class that owns the military, that, well, I mean, that owns the military, that executes indirect but sometimes pretty direct control over the military, over the political institutions of the major powers, essentially sabotages these attempts. And for me, this just means that we need a strong nation state, that we need some strong power that can protect the, in a sense, the our attempt of socialism, whilst not giving, the opening the door for any threats that come from these nations or this class that is obviously going to fight for death to not lose their power over the economy.
Right. Um, I do agree with the having a large nation state. I think it is just as necessary, and the fact that it developed in this way means that it should be something that is going to have to persist after a socialist change, if there was one. Um, I also don't think that the state should have to be gotten rid of at any particular point. To me, the contradictions in capital don't extend to the state itself. So you can have a state function within a socialist system without and still not there be hierarchy. The main problem uh, with the state is anytime there's people who are like capitalists being paid over the actual value of their labor. So if you have politicians benefiting from the power that they have with not enough checks and balances and not enough of a way to regulate the uh, the democratic aspect of it, we have problems in democracy as it is. And I'm not saying that democracy should be gotten rid of. It just needs to be fine tuned, and that can be remain the same within a capitalist system. And me personally, I believe that the jobs of the government should be extended to other areas of the economy so that and other countries do it as well, certain areas. We only limit it in the United States to education, street maintenance, and a few other things here and there, police. Uh, but we limit it to so few things that it's conceivable to expand it. It's conceivable to have it still function democratically, to function with hierarchies. You don't start up in a police force immediately at the top. You work your way through. The same with different branches of the government, and it should function just as it does a typical job. The only problem there is when people think that the government does things less efficiently than the market would do, which isn't always the case.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I think there needs to be a balance. Right now, we need to have a strong and good balance amongst these different forces in order to set the basis for a movement towards a more socialist society. I don't think. I think that we're done with all these revolution, violent aspect of this. I think we already see how it doesn't really work, and especially we see how the proletariat right now doesn't have enough power to bring about a revolution of this sort without it turning into some major human disaster. Um, I think that we need to make progressive changes, and I think that a strong state and strong worker movements in political institutions are what we should be pursuing right now, instead of these isolated attempts of revolutions and these all of these um, demonstrations of power that doesn't really exist. We still need to build the basis for a movement that is as democratic as possible for me.
Right. I wanted to mention something that David Harvey mentioned recently in a podcast. He was talking about how the uh, the mass the of the rate of surplus value is what's important. The mass of capital, not so much the rate of surplus value and the rate of exploitation. So when we have the critique from the Marxist side of the falling rate of profit, I'm sure you're familiar with the falling rate
Yeah.
of profit. However, I've always disagreed with the premise, because if you look at society, it doesn't seem to be as if there will be any end uh, because of the inequality. There's a great deal of inequality, but it continues to persist. And the fact that they make so little money off of the workers doesn't mean that they don't make a large amount as a whole.
Yeah,
That is something
absolutely.
that he mentioned recently, and a lot of people still hold the falling rate of profit as an argument that's going to be lead to the end of capitalism.
Yes, and you know what? Let's give some time to our last point that we're gonna make now, and if you want, we can speak about this particular thing, or do you want to have any as the last point that we talk about? Do you want anything in particular?
Uh, I think moving forward with socialism and communism, this could be the starting point. So to me, when you have a system that doesn't necessarily collapse due to inequality, but that can continue growing, to me it implies the opposite. That you can have a system where you can have lessening degrees of uh, of of inequality and so on. You can have a system that is less exploitative. Uh, the the capitalism functions the way it does is moving towards that one extreme. The government is there kind of as the balancing force to keep it from going overboard.
Yeah,
There's so many laws that have been passed that kind of prolong the system and to keep it going. However, these laws that are passed don't necessarily leave you from the system, uh, but in my opinion, it's provable that you can use different laws move towards a more socialist society. Will these laws be passed? It's very highly doubtful, because most of them are persuaded by the money. Uh, it's possible that the working class is able to collect enough votes that they may move away from such a society. Um, right now, it doesn't look like that's the case. Most of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party isn't even close enough to what is necessary. They want only slightly different than what we have now, but keeping within the same scheme of things. So it doesn't really change the system. To me, I think that if you have laws that are passed that move towards uh, uh, getting a clearer definition of what value is, an example, I mean, I have multiple examples. One would be the law that was talked about in, I believe, England, on how if a corporation is planning on selling and moving offshores, they are forced to sell it to the workers first. They're forced to offer it to them. The workers collectively can be given a loan that they can pay back within a reasonable amount of time, and or allow the option to purchase it and to keep their jobs. Laws like that allow for the workers to have more control and more value. Um, and to me, that's the most important thing, is that you get a fair representation of the value of the workers. Uh, workers can contribute to the economy. They can do so much, and it's any of these limiting factors. Well, a clear example for me, and one of the ones that I use the most, is in the National Football League. Uh, I don't watch as much as I used to. It's been years. They uh, have a draft when they start off in a when a player starts off into the league. They start off being chosen by the businesses, and these teams would function similar to how I would envision that a good market would function, so that they all work together to find the value that they ascribe to a particular individual, and that person is then allowed to have the opportunity to go to any of the better teams after they've set their value. And there is a lot of negotiations. There's clear representation of the value of your peers, how much they make. Anytime there's negotiations between a worker and the employer, or the player and the owner, there's clear representations of how much their peers make, how much they've produced and contributed, and what it does is to allow them to make a lot more money than people who are underpaid, and a lot closer to what their values actually were. Um, you don't have that in most businesses. You only know how much you make, and you're rarely told how much you've actually produced in relationship to others. So you don't really have all of the information. Uh, Additionally, the way that the draft functions there uh, is not a necessity within the businesses. However, it could be a luxury to have it where you're almost provided a job necessarily, and it's kind of a balancing act. Is almost can be used as a way of extending competition. A lot of the competition in different aspects of sports are things that can extend to the market, that actually truly do extend competition, but not just the competition within separate companies, but also within the workforce to compete for a more fair value. Um, there was another point that I had, but what do you think about that first?
No, I totally agree with you there. I mean, I think that social accountability and transparency, not only amongst each class, but especially between classes, is for me where the key point lies. And this is why democratizing the workplace is so important, because it opens the door to this transparency amongst employers, employees, between employers. And the best transparency possible will obviously lead to the best outcome, since the more information you have, the more likely you are to make the right decision, to make the right choice. And for me, this is where we need to go, and we're going to end it with this point. I think it's the best point to end it with, is rather than a one-time violent revolution that can give power temporarily to the workers, but we don't really know what's going to happen in the long run. We don't know what's going to happen the day after the revolution, right? For me, the key is a progressive but consistent movement towards a more transparent, a more equal, and a more free society, where individuals can have access to better information that can lead them to make better decisions, and that they have the power to make those decisions instead of being constrained by a profit motive, by um, this accumulation of capital that totally corrupts the entirety of the decision making process. What do you think?
I agree. I think that is a good way to leave off for now. It is the start of conversations on where we can move forward as a society, and those are
Yeah.
values that, or like I said, common sense values that should be imposed. And the fact that we don't have that yet, or things that do need to be changed, uh, it's it's as easy as to say that people should be paid a fair wage. People should be able to have the freedom that they don't have within the capitalist system, and
Yeah,
it's these kinds of changes, these small gradual changes that I think are moving in the right direction, and
yeah, yeah.
and
Because
that
capitalism alone doesn't bring about these circumstances that we're speaking of here. Capitalism alone cannot bring this equality, this well, not this equality, but this freedom, this good decision making. It might lead to this in short run, in some particular moments, but as we've seen already throughout history, capitalism alone doesn't bring this outcome. We need another system. And so far, because the only thing we've got is capitalism, the only thing we can work with right now is capitalism, we need to understand capitalism, see the flaws in capitalism, and move progressively to another form of society that can overcome the current flaws that we have.
yeah, I think it's a good way to leave off. I will say, just as a as my final word, that I don't believe that it's going to be easily possible to move
No,
in that direction because of the laws of the system
of
and the
capital.
way that
Yeah,
it
yeah,
functions, the way it does.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we're gonna leave it off here, but I just want to say that we're probably gonna make more live streams like this. I like the concept, and we're gonna be speaking about different things. We might make like a series where we talk about a specific thing on each one, and I will see you in the next one.